Hi there, this is Todd Banko from Prairie Edge Service. I had a request for how and what I use for holding for whetstones, and how I use and hold some of my stones that might not have mounting bars or anything like that. Because if you turn around and have something like a diamond plate, these are thin, and how do you end up putting them on something if you don't have a mounting plate? And this is a very simple solution, but I wanted to expand it out even a little bit further. If you've got a shear, and this is not a good example, but let's say worst case scenario, we've got a situation where we've got a shear that's either had its ride line totally ground out, there's no ride line, and if we turn around, and usually what I'll end up doing is I don't mark my ride line a lot of times, but even if I did, if we just did the quick little pass like that when you've got it marked, and let's say that you've actually removed this part here, and you removed this part here. So what happens, but you've got a great big gap. Let's see my other one. You got a great big gap right in here. So this is not being removed. And that comes from a situation where someone's been too aggressive with their grinding on the outside. They've ground right through the ride line. And what they have actually done, if I get my pencil again here, is they ground through the ride line and deeper down into the hollow grind. So the hollow grind is further down than the tip in this area. So how do you turn around? That's the worst case scenario. How do you turn around and fix that situation? Well, you're going to need some extra tools, because just your regular whetstones is not going to cut it. So how do we, and when you turn around and look at it, what is the problem? The real problem is this area, which establishes the cutting plane, because this is where your cutting plane is defined by, this is your bearing surface, has to be lowered down, further down into the hollow grind. So it's got to work its way down towards the pivot area. So the first thing you have to do is work on this area without affecting the rest of the blade. And this is where Nanohone has come up with what they call the Diamond Resin pivot area. And I've got two of them here. I've got the 100 and the 10 micron. So 100 micron and 10 micron. If you're doing a lot of the just the pivot area work, coarse stuff, you'd be using the 100. Even the 200 would be better. And the whole idea is, and you just need a little bit of water. I'm just going to spritz my finger here and just put a little bit of water. You don't need a lot of water with these type of things. And the whole idea is you're just working just nice and airy right over the pivot area. So you can see that not going too far out, and you need to work that down. Now, when you've got a great big gap, you can see how this is working down, and it's slowly working into the black area. And what you have to do is keep this going until you rejoin it. But for the most part, this works pretty good when you've got a very shallow indent. And let's say this was a huge indent. The other problem that I've had with the DRPAs is you can see right at this edge, we're getting into this area that we can end up having a disconnect, that this is ground down here, but we've also ground down right in this area, the blade area, deeper than what we might want in here. So we have to be very, very careful with these narrow DRPA stones that we don't damage the part of the ride line and we get this further down than what we want to. So that's one of the things about the DRPAs. I very seldom use the 10 micron. About the only time I ever need to use it is if I'm using a curve shear and I need to redress, because this this 10 micron will shine this up, this pivot area back up to what I'll say the factory finish. When I've got a really bad situation where it's a huge gap in here and we really need to work this down, I pull out my diamond plate. And the diamond plate, and you can see that both of these I don't have a holder, so I'm just like literally laying it on top of my microfiber cloth on top of my whetstone. And you can see it holds it beautifully because this plate is not the same size. And this is one of the things that I've seen some other people run into, is they can't just install it into here and into there and get it to hold. It's now tilted and stuff like that. So the real simple solution is put your leave your whetstone in your holder, such as my holder is my case. Put a microfiber cloth over top of it, fold it around, and now just lay your plate right on top of there, and it'll, like you can see, it's moving. It grips it so well, it's moving my table, my work surface. So to finish off with that, if it's really bad, I will start with the 300 grit. And the 300 grit, I'll typically just work the corner area just to work down the pivot area. If it's really bad and I need to go further out, then I'll pull it back down into a little bit further back in here. And once I can start seeing that I'm starting to get some of my marks going out, let's just do it ever so slightly here. So we can see, look at that. We're starting to get the black removed out into here. I've got this moving down, and I'm just about reconnecting up on this area. I'll switch over to the 1000 grit, and I'll start, because that 300 grit leaves some very definite marks in the ride line, and they can be deep gouges. So what you want to do is not reconnect the whole line. You want to come back to the 1000 grit, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to keep working the pivot area, and now we're starting to get a whole reconnect. Now what we do is we finish off in the whole plate just like we're doing, and we get a nice reconnect, a nice solid ride line right from the back of the J all the way to the tip. Once you've got that established, you're through the whole area. Now you go back to the whetstones. So my whetstone that I have here is a 2000 grit Gherkin errata. Some people will use a Diamond Resin or a CBN type whetstone. They can be really, really good. The one problem that I find with any of those, everything has its advantages and its disadvantage. So anything with the Diamond Resin, what I find is the swarf builds up, just like we will see with the whetstones, but it's very hard to get it out of here. Like, you can turn around and use WD-40. Sometimes I'll use alcohol, but even like on the 10 micron, I'm still not getting it out. The swarf is filling it up and effectively changing the grit resolution of the Diamond Resin. So I prefer the whetstone, actually. I'll come back to my whetstone. This is my primary, so I'm going to turn around and do a few passes. And my whole idea here is I would inspect this and to see if I've got a nice continuous ride line. It's very nicely shined up all the way along. And the thing about this is that what you want to do is what I call running the light up the line. You want to see the edge of the light. There it is. You want to watch that edge of that light run all the way up the line, the ride line, to see how effective you are and if you made a complete assessment. This one would be done, And the other thing that I'm looking for is how smooth have I got it? Have I got all of those 1000 grit scratches out? Then I'd turn around and possibly do some more of that, because 1000 to 2000 does effectively remove those 1000 grit scratches. Now at this point in time, I would go back to my flathone and I would start doing the outside. If this was close to the let's say it's 45 degrees, and it truly is effectively 45 degrees the last time it was sharpened, just someone sharpened through the ride line, I would start at 600 grit, do my 600 grit, pull the burr, so the burr is going to fold up this way, then do it, and I'm doing it about 30 to 40% speed. Then I go to 1200 grit to polish and remove the scratches from the 600 grit. And then I go to my polishing pad, and I'm polishing that because the burr is still up this way. The burr is protecting me from not over polishing the edge. Once I've got that whole outside all done, now I'm coming back to the whetstone. What I'm doing is I'm coming back to this whetstone. This is a gherkin kakiyaki. And one of the things that I find, like the gherkin errata, it truly is one where you spray it down and it doesn't soak in a lot, but I find that kakiyaki is quite a lot more porous. It sucks in the water, like you can just see how the water is just being sucked in here into the stone because I haven't soaked this. So you have to be a lot more liberal with your water, and just once it stops sucking it in, then turn around, and remember, you've got that burr sticking out this way. If you've got a lot of polishing compound on your thing, go and wipe down your shear. Just clean your shear off. Even though that burr is still there, just get all of your polishing compound off your shear. And last thing is, start at the top, place it down, pull back, and what that's going to do is the burr is going to flip up, pointing now out along the edge instead of around the bottom. It's just going to flip out like this. What I like to do is then complete, I don't know, half dozen of passes on the inside ride line. So what that's going to do is it's just going to redo that burr right up to the edge and flip it up to the outside. And like that burr is still going to be there, but what it really does is it polishes up this ride line. Now, why am I using a 5000 grit? In the factory, they use either a CBN wheel on a flathone. Typically, to start the ride line, they'll use 600 grit. To finish the ride line, they'll use 1200 grit. But that 1200 grit is running at typically 3000 or 4000 RPM. And depending on how much pressure they do, think of this as being a great big CBN. If they just put a little bit of pressure, that's going to be the equivalent of maybe 5000 grit, 6000 grit. If they put a lot of pressure, then it's going to come down to about a 3000 grit. So it really depends on how much pressure that is. But the speed of 1200 grit running at 3000 grit, 3000 RPM, is going to give you something a heck of a lot finer than 1200. And that's the reason why I'm going with 5000 grit, is that it truly gives you the factory feel, and it should be totally polished ride line. You can see now it's true mirror finish with the 5000 grit, and it gives me the factory feel and factory quietness to the shear. Because if you're just doing with a 2000 grit or something like that, yes, it is smooth. It is not quite mirror polished, but when you go and open the action of the shear, you can still hear it. When you turn around and go up to 4000 or 5000 grit stone, you no longer get the noise, and you get truly a factory feel on opening and closing that shear on the shear plane. So that's just a quick video. Like I said, the products that I'm using, just to recap, um, the Nanohone, the Diamond Resin pivot area, I'm using 100 micron, uh, and the 10 micron. If I had to do it again, I probably wouldn't get the 10 micron because I don't do a lot of curved shear, but I need that for curved shears. For really bad work, I find the 1300 grit is my go-to for truly fixing this. The DRPAs with the narrow sticks just don't quite do it. It's just too small of an area, but I can do everything with the diamond plate. Then the Gherkin Errata 2000 grit and the Gherkin Kakiyaki at 5000 grit is what I'm currently doing. I will be getting a diamond resin, probably a 3000 grit, but it's not so much for these type of shears. What I want to use it for is some of the ceramic shears. I need to polish up. I'll use my diamond plate at 1000 to work the rideline, and then I'll use a 3000 on the ceramic shears to finish the rideline, and that's the primary reason. The other thing that I should talk about that is why I'm not using the diamond resins is you can see here how even just that little bit of action that I did on this, the 5000 grit starts to collect swarf in the groove. The 2000 is coarse enough that it peels it away, but anything of these finer grits, it does collect the swarf. And how do you get rid of that? If it's the diamond resin, you need to clean it with either like an alcohol or WD-40, but you can see even when I turn around and clean this one a number of times, I've still got swarf in there. And this is where with the whetstones, the ceramic whetstones, I can use a Nagura stone and I can truly clean this up in the field and get rid of the swarf and get me back to a true grit without that, because that swarf does affect the grit. Just by using my Nagura stone, my microfiber cloth, clean that up, and I'm good to go again. Now, the one downfall is whetstones, they will dish out with the work because we're applying all the pressure over the pivot area. So this is going to dish out. There's not as much work at the tip, so the pivot area will dish out. You will not get that with this, but they do wear. But because it's so thin, you have no idea how to flatten and true that up when they do start to wear. Whereas with the whetstone, yes, about every 10 shears or once a day, depending on how many shears I do a day, I have to take and flatten my whetstones. So they're good for about 10 to 15 shears. If I only do 5 shears in one day and 5 the next day, then it'll be every second day. So I flatten. You have to maintain that flatness in your whetstones to maintain, because the whole idea about it is you need the shear plane from around the pivot area here is, let me just grab the other shear. The flatness, if you've got a dished out area here, you've got a different plane here than happening across the blade. So what that effectively does is, here's my plane over the pivot area, and if this plane here is not the same plane along the blade, you're going to turn around and, I'm just going to exaggerate this, but you're either going to dish in or dish out your leading edge. You're either going to create a gap. Let's do it this way. So if this is coming down, the contact point is either going to be hard in or is going to be at the bottom of the ride line instead of at the top of the ride line, and then produces a gap. once that gap is formed, then it's going to start folding hair. So this is why the flatness of your whetstones is so important for your ride line. Even though that ride line can be so small, that becomes your contact point. And you can effectively have a problem that you can have an apexed edge, but if your ride line is forming a gap at the edge down where the contact point is down here instead of up here, you're going to end up having hair cutting problems. If you got the opposite where it's always up in here, now this blade that is making the contact at the top is going to cut in. So this blade, so if we got this like this again, if this one is tilted out like this and the contact point is right at the leading edge, this blade is going to peel metal and form a burr on the opposite blade. It's going to actually remove the metal and dull that blade out because it's not in the cutting plane motion. So that's why it's so important to make sure to keep your whetstones flat and your ride line truly in the working plane of the pivot area. So this plane here has to be maintained all the way down the edge of the blade. Hope that was useful. Thanks for watching. Like I said, this was a requested video on one area about how I hold with the other areas, but I figured let's touch a few more birds with one stone and cover a bunch of different areas on working the ride line through the different options to deal with a problem situation. Thanks again. Catch you in the next video.